كلمة.
Okay, go ahead.
English channel test. English channel test. English channel test. تمام. Okay.
Yeah, okay. I'll hold on to the mic. My mic now. I won't lose it. Okay?
First part, then you speak to the podium. Once you finish your first part, you can leave the mic here.
Okay.
Okay? Got me?
I got you.
Here's the clicker. Turn it on once you're about to start.
Oh. Yeah. Perhaps no issue is more important to our livelihoods, our well-being, and to the planet, and yet more overlooked than biodiversity. Scientists estimate that every single day, some 10,000 species go extinct. 10,000. And the actual number might actually be 10 times higher than that. Yet we come together today because there are opportunities to arrest this crisis, and if I can say so, to save the planet. Please welcome to an extremely important discussion on mainstreaming nature and biodiversity in infrastructure investments. My name is Michael Suado. I'm your host today. I'm based in Singapore, and I am passionate about promoting thought leadership, something which is desperately needed on the issue of biodiversity. And fortunately, we are joined by an esteemed panel today that share this concern. To kick things off, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. She is Egypt's Minister of the Environment. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Yasmin Fuad.
Good afternoon. Let me at the outset welcome you all in the city of peace. But we call it, me and my colleagues, another name, the city of mangroves, Sharm El Sheikh. Very much aligned with the topic of our session today. And let me thank the AIIB for organizing that event. I hope it ends up with different successful and fruitful deliberations. I was requested to give a keynote remarks before the session, but I just felt that it would be much more easier and flexible if we were able to give some insights to the story of the biodiversity and infrastructure. Ecosystem services is simply, with the biodiversity, everything that surrounds us, which is the food we eat, the water we drink, the shelter, and the clothes that we wear, in a very simple way, in a simple form, especially that I know that I'm very privileged to have around the table here most of the finance ministers and finance people, so I'll not try to speak from the very stereotyped technical environment point of view, but rather from the finance in a more simple language. When we come to numbers, we find that around $44 trillion of the economic value generation is depending on nature, and how much we're losing from nature or how much we're benefiting and how best we're efficiently using that. So the figures are really stunning, because the more we lose from our nature, from our habitat, the less services we're having, and the more damage to the economy that we would be facing. We have different risks, actually, in fact, that if we would like to link up the economy with the biodiversity. There are physical risks that are related to the degradation of nature and ecosystem services. And let me give a very simple example on that. The tourism sector is depending on coral reefs around a coastal area. The more we damage the coral reefs, or even we don't damage that, the more we are overusing the coral reefs, the less opportunity for the tourism sector to grow. This is one thing. Another thing, the transition risk, which is how are we aligning with the economic actors, such as the tourism sector, the oil and gas sector that would be expanding in fetching for oil, and the restoration and the protection. And here comes the important role of the infrastructure. Because when we design an infrastructure that is nature friendly, that is nature positive, the more we're beginning the story in the right way. And from that perspective, the world has agreed in 2018 that we need to understand and to make biodiversity better conserved. And that's why this same city, the same room, the same convention has hosted COP14, the Conference of Parties for the Biodiversity Convention. We were privileged as Egyptians to lead over the design of the global biodiversity framework post-2020. And during that time, we wanted to change the narrative around the story. We wanted to make sure that there are three things that is happening in the future of handling the biodiversity. First of all, the private sector should be an integral part of that. Secondly, the financial architecture around the biodiversity should be more nature friendly and nature positive, because that's very important. Three, we need to put more targets that are implementable, because previously we had targets that we were never able to achieve. And this is how the global biodiversity framework came into reality with my dear colleague, Minister of Environment for China, and the Canadian Minister in Kimong, Montreal, Biodiversity Roadmap and Framework. And from that story, I'd like to stress on two important facts. First fact, that there is a huge opportunity for inclusion of the private sector in biodiversity conservation and nature positive. But we need to be innovative in doing that. We need to create the demand and the supply. And here I found an important role for the MDBs. We never looked at the issue of biodiversity as we look, for an example, on renewables when we talk about the other world of the climate, because we don't think that that would provide revenues. But the fact says that even an hotel that decides to put on solar panels or use a treated wastewater or take the green fence, which is an international standard for how they do their tourism activity in the water, does reduce the operational cost, and still it is gaining that. And the quality of the tourists that would go to such an hotel is different than the stereotype. So there is more revenue in that story in a simple way. So how can we support better the inclusion of the private capital and the private sector in the biodiversity conservation and ecosystem restoration? One, the MDBs has to align with the new global biodiversity framework and be able to understand how can they work better, because there's no size that fits all. We cannot say that the LDCs, the SIDS, that Africa, which is a very big part for nature, can be dealt with like other places in Europe. This is one thing. The other thing is that the MDB can pitch in to do a de-risking to the private capital that is going to invest in ecosystem restoration. Because without the de-risking, we will not be able to achieve the inclusion of the private sector. And more loans, more debt will go at the level of the governments, because they need to achieve the targets of 30 by 2030, which is the biodiversity framework. The last but not least is the disclosure from the investors on where are the risks that they see. Are the risks related only to finance, or they need to see a more robust legal and regulatory framework at the national level so that they can move ahead with their investment? Last but not least is our story in Egypt. How we turned our story of protected areas that are not touched. 15% of Egypt land is declared as protected areas, by the way. So 15% of that are not touched, they're not utilized, and the government spent every year in conservation and protection. We shifted the narrative so that the part of the protected area is financially sustained without relying on the resources that we take from the Ministry of Finance. That's a very interesting story for all ministers of finance here, so they don't have to invest in biodiversity and conservation. Secondly, we created the product of ecotourism in 13 touristic destinations in protected area. Thirdly, we provided private sector concession finance for private sector to invest in activities of ecotourism in protected areas. Fourth, we included the local community with more job opportunities with the private sector to make more conservation. So everyone was winning. The private sector was winning. The local community was an integral part of the conservation and the restoration, and yet we are restoring their culture, their songs, their food, and the government is much more happier because they are able even to provide more revenues. In 3 years, we were able to increase our revenues from protected area 120% in just focusing on 4 or 5 protected areas, because not every protected area can be a destination for ecotourism activity. I just wanted to give some insights to that and to say that it's never too late. We can really work out together collectively in partnership, in changing the governance structure. The financial architecture of the biodiversity is now ready to absorb the private capital with the support of the MDBs. And last but not least, holding every single one accountable to their roles, because we simply cannot survive on the one and only planet, the Earth, without the ecosystem services and nature. And last, nature can pay back and take revenge in 100 million ways, and COVID is a very simple example of that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Your Excellency. I don't know the last time I heard such an inspiring speech from a minister in government about taking accountability and about how investing in our environment will reap rewards, not just for the planet, but also for our countries and our communities. Thank you very much for sharing those remarks. Now, I don't know if you noticed when you entered the room today what the name of it is. El Alamein. It was a very important site back in World War II where the Allies stopped the Nazi advance. They halted the Nazis at El Alamein. Today in this room, in this El Alamein, we are gathered to halt biodiversity loss. And to place this in context, AIIB has prepared a short video. Let's take a look. All right, thank you very much, AIIB, for producing that and placing the story a bit in context, giving us some stories, some pictures to take a look at, we can think about as we dive deeper into this discussion. I'd like to invite our panelists onto the stage. I'll introduce you once you're seated. If I can invite our panelists to please join us on stage. Dr. Yasmin, can you join us as well? So we have two multilateral development banks. We have the Chinese Import-Export Bank and representatives of sovereign government who are joining us to take a deeper dive into these issues. Before I introduce them, please join me in giving them a round of applause. We've already met Her Excellency Dr. Yasmin Fuad. Next to her, we have His Excellency Teofilusi Tueti. He is Tonga's Minister for Finance and National Planning. Next to him, we have Sir Danny Alexander, who leads AIIB's Environmental and Social Policies. Mr. Adonai Herrera Martinez focuses on environmental and sustainability issues at EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And last but not least, we have Mr. Zhang Wenchai, who is Vice President of the Export-Import Bank of China. To kick things off, Sir Danny, I'm going to ask the first question to you. Help set the stage for us. Yesterday, the AIIB launched its first climate action plan. It also addresses the critical importance of mainstreaming nature and biodiversity. So tell us a bit more about that, please.
So firstly, thank you very much, and thank you also to our panelists for joining us today. This is a very important discussion. You saw the video, which probably explained our ideas on this better than I can. Although I noticed that at the end it says nature as infrastructure. I think we should go one step further and say nature is infrastructure. And that gives us the kind of framing for why this is such an important issue for AIIB. My colleague Alberto Nino, who's the bank's general counsel, led our delegation at COP15 in Montreal last year. And we see that framework on the global biodiversity framework as something that is very important direction for MDBs, for how we need to go about going further than what we started to do when the bank was founded, and I think what all MDBs do, which is to try and do no harm through our environmental and social policies, which require us to examine this in every project, and to think about how we can deliver nature-positive outcomes through our investments. So yesterday, as you say, we launched our climate action plan, and one of the principles of the climate action plan is to be impactful, and one part of that is to say that we often talk about climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and nature as separate things. But we've really got to be trying to think about those three things together in a holistic way. As the video said, there are co-benefits for climate in nature projects, and the examples the minister gave in her wonderful speech, are really good examples of that. And so, as we implement our climate action plan, which is focused towards delivering on our goals of more than half of our financing being climate finance, and our particular focus in Asia, not only on mitigation, but also on adaptation and resilience, which is, there are hundreds of millions of people in Asia who are vulnerable now to the direct effects of climate change. Then nature and nature-based solutions are a critical part of how we can deliver on those climate goals. And the way we'll be thinking about delivering that climate action plan is to think about those three things together. And we're already doing that in many of our projects, which I will perhaps explain in answer to one of the next rounds of questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Danny. I'd like to go now from the big picture and zoom in on an example. On one side of the screen here, you see some pictures that I took from Tonga's tourism board. Don't know about you, but I would certainly love to go swimming with whales. On the other side, we see a story, a headline about volcanic disaster, about a calamity. And unfortunately, both of these are taking place at the same time. We can see that Tonga is being affected by calamities. So, Minister Teo, I'd like to ask you, could you tell us a bit more about this and how biodiversity loss is impacting livelihoods and economic activity?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm very happy to be here, especially the first time for Tonga to attend the AIIB Annual Meeting. Yes, Tonga was hit hard last year by a double disaster, which included a volcanic eruption that caused a tsunami in the country, but also together with the COVID-19 lockdown, it tended to affect the economy. I agree with the speaker today from the Honourable Minister that the biodiversity is one issue that I think is being taken for granted in most governments and not really addressed the negative impact of it. But Tonga agree that we face a triple global crisis in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And these issues are interconnected and have far-reaching consequences worldwide. And we must tackle these challenges together as a global community. We all understand that biodiversity, as the Minister said, is a foundation of life on Earth, and our ecosystems rely on the diverse range of animals, plants, and microorganisms to function properly. And biodiversity is important as well for climate resilience, as you all aware, and also with it comes with control and disease prevention, as we witness. One example from the impact of the human activities and biodiversity can be seen in the main island of Tonga, and it was affected also by this disaster. In the main island, we have a lagoon, which used to be home to diverse and productive ecosystems, but it has suffered due to increased development and pollution. Sediment runoff, overharvesting, and the and pollution caused by the biodiversity loss and lagoon deterioration. The damage to mangroves, seagrass, beds, and coral reefs impacts local communities' livelihoods and resources like fuel wood and medicinal plants. To address these issues, the government is implementing a reach-to-reef approach to rehabilitate the lagoon. Technical, human, and financial assistance is still needed for effectively tackling the environmental challenges we face. This example serves as a reminder that similar situations are occurring not only in the Pacific Islands, but also worldwide, and urgent action is needed. So just to conclude my remarks on that, the interconnection of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution demands a collaborative effort to protect and restore our ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Teo. And for those of you who don't know, the day begins in Tonga. It is right past the international date line. It's one of the first countries in the world to start every new day. So let's start again by halting biodiversity loss in Tonga. Now, I'd like to share another example here. I don't know if you recall these headlines from a couple years ago in the Marmara Sea in Turkey. Some of you may recall it. It was described as a slimy calamity, or even as sea snot blanketing the sea. It was caused by a combination of pollution and climate change. It became so thick that seagulls could walk on it, and it cuts off oxygen below, killing off fish, corals, and other sea life. You can imagine the impact both on the ecosystem as well as on the local fishing industry and on tourism. Clearly, we want to prevent calamities like this from occurring in the future. So Adonai, I'd like to ask you about the EBRD approach on nature-positive investments and biodiversity.
Thank you, Michael. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank the Egyptian authorities and the people of Egypt for hosting us in this beautiful environment in Dunia, and the AIIB colleagues for the kind invitation to speak here today in this stellar panel, I must say. And thanks for the question. When we first started thinking about the blue economy and biodiversity theme in EBRD, we were received by our bankers with rolling eyes, as yet again tree huggers thinking out of the box in an institution that is focused on private sector in a region that is whose natural capital is heavily depleted because of former Soviet Union, right? Heavily industrialized. But as Minister Teofilousi mentioned, we realized that it is through pollution prevention what we acquired experience in mitigating the main drivers for biodiversity loss. And actually, we have a colleague here that used to work with us, Alex Ativanov. We started looking into, in a way, the paradigmatic example of a partnership that drove the recovery of the Baltic ecosystem through wastewater investments, the so-called Northern Dimension Environmental Partnership. So we were fortunate enough that there was an international consortium focused on the Helsinki Convention that was monitoring the status, the environmental status of the Baltic ecosystems. And over 20 years, through 1.3 billion euros in investment, collectively with the AIIB, KfW, ourselves, EBRD, we managed to start reverting the damage and having clear biodiversity outcomes with the return of fish stocks, the return of white-tailed eagles, and even apex predators like gray seals. So looking back, we realized that we have much more, and actually collectively, we have much more experience than meets the eye through pollution prevention. That's why we are now currently trying to translate that experience in the Baltic into the Mediterranean, and actually working together with Minister Fouad and our dear Nasser Kamel, the Secretary General of the Union for the Mediterranean, we're trying to create a partnership. We actually launched that partnership at COP27 in this same city in order to actually mobilize grant money, to do blended finance and catalyze policy reform and support of blue economy investments. So just to close my intervention, not just we have experience, but investing and recovering nature is part of the ethos as MDBs, because we are created to promote transition towards environmentally sustainable market economies. So yes, I leave it here and pass on the microphone to Wenchai.
Thank you, Adonai. It's great to hear that there's the possibility of success, of reversing disasters, calamities, if you will, and of promoting the ecosystems. As AIIB President Jin often says, nature is the infrastructure of infrastructures. Yet the economics of nature and biodiversity can be quite challenging. Traditionally, I mean, perhaps if you studied economics in school, you remember that pollution is an externality. But the economist Partha Dasgupta writes that many of the processes that shape our world are silent and invisible. It's difficult to assign blame or to address environmental issues from within the boundaries of one country alone, which I think brings us to the MDBs. So Danny, at the AIIB, how do you address this dilemma?
So I think many people here may also have attended the seminar yesterday with our chief economist, Eric Bergloff, talking about the Asia Infrastructure Finance Report that we're preparing this year on the topic of nature as infrastructure, and which is particularly looking at these questions that you're raising. I mean, we know that nature and its ecosystems have a huge role in underpinning and providing resources for sustainable development. We know, we saw the figures on the screen there from PwC suggesting that 55% of GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature, and we know about the interactions between nature and climate change, and also resilience in the face of climate change. And yet, we don't really know how to value these things in a way that can be properly integrated into decision-making processes. And so, the flagship report that is in the final stages of preparation now will look at the valuation of nature and its ecosystem services that can be integrated more into project appraisal, how to make traditional grey infrastructure more nature positive, including piloting natural capital valuation models in cost-benefit analysis processes. It sounds rather technical, but actually it's very important, because of what it means is that we'll have or we hope to have a more systematic way of actually taking into account what is the economic value, what is the natural capital that is involved in the natural impacts or nature benefits that we can deliver through our projects, and through that really to develop this concept of nature as infrastructure. You know, the idea that forests, wetlands, mangroves, coral reefs deliver infrastructure services and therefore can be considered infrastructure. You know, we're the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, so people think that means we're only going to invest in roads and railways and wind farms and this kind of thing. But actually, and the minister in her presentation rightly referenced this. Many of the things that human beings seek to achieve through pouring large amounts of concrete can be actually achieved more cost effectively and with more co-benefits for nature, for the other creatures that inhabit our planet, if we think about utilizing nature for that purpose instead. And so we're also working on several projects around our membership, where either there are efforts made to mitigate or offset the impacts on nature of those projects, or which are seeking to apply nature-based solutions altogether. And I should say, by the way, you know, this is something that MDBs as a family work very closely together on. You know, post the Kunming-Montreal Declaration, an inter-MDB working group was established so that we can have common ideas and processes and procedures, and think about how do we take this global biodiversity framework and align our operations with it. So it's quite a complicated thing, but the system is working very well. And Adonai invited me to his panel on nature at their annual meeting in Samarkand in May, so we're delighted to return the compliment. And I think EBRD is really a leader in this space, so great that also we can share our experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. It's really interesting to hear the perspectives of the two MDBs here. Wenchai, we were talking a bit before the session, and I was really struck by the size and the breadth of what the Chinese Import-Export Bank does. So could you share with us a bit about why or how nature and biodiversity is important to the Export-Import Bank of China?
Thank you. Yeah, like you said, China Exim Bank, as a state-owned policy banks, and we have been doing this development business for almost 30 years. So I think we support a lot of projects in different countries, Asia, including probably Asia, Africa, Pacific Island countries, Latin American, countries. So certainly, given the size of our operation at the country level, at the regional and global level, so certainly we feel that as a responsible, policy bank, we certainly should, make our due contribution, right, to the nature protection, to biodiversity protection. So I think this, know that, from the Chinese government side, government of China has attached great importance to environmental protection over the years. Like they also, attach great importance to the poverty alleviation, among, other development challenges they are trying to address. So environmental issue has been always at the core part of their development strategy. So that the government of China also announced their dual carbon target for 2060, that. So I think over the years, now the government, China is advancing to the modernization process. So I think, one of the big, concept they have, they always mention is about how to build the harmony between nature and also the man and mankind. So this is something, that as country move to the, modernization process, this is something that they always bear in mind, how to protect the environment, protect nature, protect biodiversity. So this is something, President Xi Jinping always mentioned about his ideas of having, this Lucy water and also the large mountains are really invaluable assets. So I think this has been, this kind of concept has been, in the heart of the Chinese people. So and also, since the ancient time, that Chinese people, they always believe that this harmony between humanity and the nature. So I think right now, so more and more attention has been given to the environmental protection. So I think looking ahead, China Exim Bank, we will, of course, as we develop more infrastructure project in different countries, including the project for the, road, railway, port, airport, water supply, irrigation facilities. We certainly needed to address this environmental issue, nature issues, biodiversity. So I think we will, because this is also related to the project risk, that we feel as a bank. Because if you don't address this environmental climate risk well, you may also face risk as a financial institution. So I think we should, even pay more attention to this, this kind of risk in the coming days.
Most definitely. I'd like to move now from an overview to some of the challenges. And for this, we're going to go back to Tonga again, which is on the front lines of climate change. And climate change is so intricately interlinked with biodiversity. So I'd like to start by asking you, Minister Teo, what would you say are the biggest challenges to addressing the biodiversity crisis in Tonga?
Thank you again, Michael. Tonga faces a significant challenge in conserving biodiversity, which often requires balancing environmental preservation with economic growth and navigating conflicts between landowner rights and government responsibilities. Losing biodiversity not only poses a risk to Tonga, but also to the Pacific, neighboring Pacific Island countries, the global economy, the human well-being. Just before I continue, if you wonder where Tonga is, because Tonga is a small island in the Pacific. It's just 2.5 hours flight north of New Zealand and 1 hour flight east of Fiji. So, and 4 hours from Sydney, Australia. So it is very town at the south hemisphere. But like any other countries, we face the same challenges in regard to biodiversity. And I think for a small country, you may not understand what it's like to be a small country. And one of the issue that I can see is I can see now is one of the biodiversity challenge of being a small island country, is trying to copy what the other big countries are like in terms of development. And what I mean is that when you try to build something, if you try to build roads and infrastructure, you take out all the grass and the trees, and because you're trying to look at it as like the big countries. But now we see the big countries, they replant back the grass and the trees, so we might have lost something. And rather than thinking about how we can conserve our biodiversity and also what we already have, and try to build on our infrastructure based on that as well. So I think it's something that maybe multi-development banks can look at, that when they run a project in a small island country, that they take into account that a certain percentage of conserving the biodiversity must be there, So if the plan is to take out grass and trees and put cement and everything, they have to maybe only 10% of the grass to be taken out, and find a way to build while conserving the trees and the grass, because they're already there. It's nature. They grown, rather than put cement there in the whole place, and then 10 years from then we should have put some trees back into the area. So it's one area that maybe to consider in running of the projects. Also, biodiversity issue in Tonga, considering the current global energy crisis and economic disruptions. We also acknowledge the importance of diversifying energy supplies sources to enhance energy security and affordability in Tonga. We are committed to taking immediate short and medium-term actions on these critical areas as well. Also, in terms of our diversity challenges in Tonga, we are dedicated to leveraging synergies and avoiding trade-offs as we address climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and land degradation, as I mentioned, and the energy crisis. We aim to accelerate the clean energy transition, promote the resource efficiency and circular economy, and achieve the UN 2030 agenda. By prioritizing the conservation of biodiversity and finding a balance between environmental preservation and economic growth, Tonga can contribute to the well-being of its people and neighboring countries as well. So it's an issue that we are taking, going forward, we will have a look at it very seriously, especially on conserving what we have now in our country. Thank you.
Mr. Teo, just a quick follow-up. You're the Minister of Finance. To what extent do fiscal considerations and debt come into play? Do they hamper your efforts to fight biodiversity loss?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Okay, I think for us in finance, it is a challenge in finance, and as the Minister for Environment said, it's something that is not come up as prominent an issue when we discuss the budget. We often talk about climate change, environment, but it seems that biodiversity is seen somewhere there in the discussion to come into prominent in the area. So addressing the triple crisis, as I mentioned before, requires significant financial resources. Therefore, we emphasize the need to mobilize funds from private and public sources, both domestically and internationally. Reaffirm our commitment to public finance and recognize the importance of promoting private investments in Tonga, including blended finance and innovative finance. We consider it is very crucial to finance flows aligned with our objectives and to combat climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution, as well as advance resource efficiency and circular economy. We must also address the barriers faced by marginalized individuals and underrepresented groups in accessing finance. So by taking these actions, we can make a significant progress towards a sustainable future. So we I think that's what we urge the all nations and MDBs to join this adventure and make collective actions to address the urgent challenges we face.
Thank you, Minister. A bit earlier, Danny mentioned some of the challenges when it comes to mainstreaming biodiversity and quantifying it, quantifying the economic benefits and how that factors into economic decisions. So my question is for Adonai. I understand you've done some work in this area on nature capital valuation. Can you tell us a bit more about how this works and your experience using it?
Thanks, Michael. Just closing my previous intervention, while we have some experience on addressing biodiversity loss, that is clearly not enough to achieve the global biodiversity framework targets and I think objectives of living in harmony with nature by 2050 that Vice President Wenchai mentioned. And I think a very clear example of the magnitude of the problem is the plastic waste, right? I was reading the other day that we, as an average, ingest about 5 grams of microplastics per week. So basically a credit card per week through our food systems, either ingest or breathing. So obviously we need to do much more than pollution prevention. We need to change our economic systems, right? And one of the biggest problems that we face is that rarely the value of nature is actually assessed, and therefore not taken into consideration. I think Danny mentioned it before. It makes complete sense in order to internalize the environmental externalities we face. So complementary to the work that the World Bank has been doing for many years in accounting for natural capital at sovereign levels, that is a top-down approach. We develop a model that we share with our colleagues from AIIB, and I'm really glad to see that they are ahead of us now in that work, to actually look into the value of ecosystem services at project level and at landscape or seascape level, basically to look where we are going to invest, see what are the ecosystem services that the environment provides to humanity, and then see what is the value at risk and what are the opportunities to enhance those ecosystem services. And think about, in this environment, see about the seascape, right? This location could be more suitable. The tens of thousands of families whose livelihoods depend on the natural capital around us, not just hotels, but also diving centers we were talking about, and they all mostly depend on the status of coral reefs, right? And an example that I typically use when I speak is, again, the diving community in Egypt. I find it inspiring to see how careful that community is with the coral reefs. And it's an example because they've internalized the need to preserve those coral reefs for their livelihood, right? So what we're doing is to develop a model to assess natural capital, integrate it into our environmental social due diligence, to when it's suitable, to understand what is, again, the value at risk and the opportunities, and then carry out strategic assessments like the pilot we did in the coastal region of between Hurghada and Marsa Alam, and try to understand how we could enhance the sustainable tourism opportunities in Egypt and elsewhere if possible.
Sorry for that, but I need to intervene here. When we look on the environmental assessment or the social assessment of a big infrastructure project, that's very good because this is how you're trying to value the natural capital and the assets and its benefit to the communities around. However, what I see is more innovative yet challenging is to look on what kind of interventions that could be added to increase the opportunities for further conservation. And let me here pitch into the example of His Excellency the Minister from Togo and your question, Michael, on the climate and the biodiversity. On a coastal area, and there is a big resort that's going to be constructed, you're requesting as a bank the environmental and social impact assessment and try to see the risk and mitigate that. If we turn that story into more than that of implementing nature-based solution because there is a sea level rise, here you're hitting 3 targets. The loss of biodiversity, adaptation to climate change, and sustainable economic growth to the tourism sector. And this thing is what we would like the MDBs to do. It's not the idea of either or. The idea of either or is definitely a no way to go and a recipe for failure. When we talk to the MDBs telling them, take biodiversity or climate, we need to link them both together.
Someone told me to drop the whole idea of either or and go with either and. Danny, I'd like to pass to you here from the AIIB's perspective. Would you like to respond to what you've heard?
I take it as great guidance from one of our important shareholders about how we should improve. So thank you very much, Minister. I would just say that we try hard within the context of our projects to make sure that we're really thinking about what is the impact on nature and biodiversity, as well as the impact on people and affected communities, climate, and so forth, and then to take whatever steps we can in those projects to mitigate or to deliver benefits or to offset. So, for example, we have a project and I should say many of the colleagues who work on this are here in this room. We have, our project teams. We have our operational services department that contains real experts in climate, in environment, in biodiversity, who really take this extremely seriously at the project level. So one project in Turkey, which was disrupting or could have disrupted a lake and its river basin, instead we put in place measures to help to protect and enhance the habitat for the rare species of ducks that were living in these. I'm very interested in birds myself, so apologies for picking these examples. But what we're trying to do is exactly what you said, which is to find projects which are in themselves nature-based solutions to start with, and to finance those nature-based solutions, which can often be, which are quite, can be quite different. So we have a project in Inner Mongolia, which is it's enhancement and restoration of the river that goes through the city, which is about reviving the wetlands, using natural solutions to reduce flood risks and improve resilience. We have another project which is marine ecological restoration and protection, where the local community wants to restore the marine environment, and that includes, as was being said earlier, restoring the mangroves, which has then many knock-on effects in terms of resilience to floods and coastal storms, and also creates a better habitat for fish. So it supports the fishermen to have a better better catch, I guess, is perhaps a simple way to put it. And so, we see those kind of projects as ones that are just as much infrastructure as the kind of traditional infrastructure. And the more we can use those solutions to the problems that our clients are bringing to us, the better.
Wenchai, I'd like to bring you back in the conversation here. What are some of the challenges at the China Import-Export Bank, both internally and with your stakeholders, when it comes to these issues?
Yeah, I think it's, we are doing the project every year. As I said, many countries. I think one of the challenges we feel that certainly we now is how we manage our ongoing project, that will have will not impose any negative impact, right, on nature and biodiversity. And also, as we prepare a new project, also, right, every year we have to also to make a very solid environmental impact assessment, and also the also related action plan, right, for the environmental management, and protection. So I think very often we feel internally we may be a lack of enough expertise or staff who are really familiar with the nature or biodiversity. We used to have many talent people working on the economic, financial side, and even technical side. But very often maybe we should maybe hire more right, specialists, right, who are really familiar with the, the policies, legal law or regulations related to nature and the environmental biodiversity protection. So I feel this is something we needed to do more from human resources development perspective. And of course, externally, we feel that we also needed to learn how to manage in our consultation engagement with outside, the stakeholder, including with the government, particularly for the project, right? Project areas, local communities, civil society organization, and contractors, companies, among others. So I think we needed to further improve our engagement, consultations with those stakeholders. And also we think very often as we do a project in other developing countries, particularly in low-income countries, they may be also, they don't have a clear strategy on the environmental, on biodiversity protection, so side. So I think if they don't have that clear strategy or plan for the nature, and also for the biodiversity. So for us, as we do project, we also feel we don't have that kind of guidance from the countryside. So I think and also I think in the coming days, so we needed to do more capacity building. We needed to have hire more talent people who are really very familiar with nature and biodiversity, kind of challenges. So among others, I think more engagement with the stakeholders, at the regional level, at the global level.
Thank you very much, Wenchai. I heard that the Import-Export Bank of China needs policy experts and technical experts. So anyone in the audience, people watching on the stream, they're hiring. So I'd like to move now from challenges to opportunities, and for this, bring the conversation back to Egypt. Earlier this month, Egypt held its first climate and environmental forum. Its first climate and environment investment forum. It also launched an online platform to link investors with green opportunities across Egypt. I'm sure there are probably a number of potential investors in the audience today who would like to know more about this. So Minister Yasmin, could you please tell us a bit more about some of the opportunities that you see?
Yeah, thank you very much. The opportunities are really based on the platform, raising the awareness that biodiversity and nature could be simply an opportunity for investment. All of the discussion that we had this session was mainly focusing on the marine environment and the habitat, but the biodiversity goes beyond that to the land, for an example. So when we plant like the cactus and the jojoba, and we use the oil for the formulation of the biodiesel or for the cosmetic that would be used in industry, that is an opportunity. With a full feasibility study on the return on investment from 3 to 4 years. What we're trying to do with that platform is first, we need to raise awareness and build national capacities that the green goes beyond the climate, and the green could be related to nature. And the nature is not the tourism, and that we can all be connected and if the opportunity is well studied. Secondly, other opportunities are related to ecotourism inside the protected area. As I mentioned before, everyone around in Egypt was thinking that because it's called protected, then it's not touched, or it should not be touched. And by the way, I was one of those people since I joined the ministry in 1997. I always had that concept, but the concept evolved as the global challenges evolved and we started to think differently. Or otherwise, we will be losing the land that we announced as protected for the sake of development. And that's why we wanted to utilize the protected area in development process, in engaging the private sector, in a whole inclusive process of the local community that should not be delinked from the development pathways just because they live at the borderline of Egypt and Sudan, or because they are at the borderline of the Mediterranean Sea. They should not be detached, as well as try to build our own sustainable self-revenue mechanism. And by that, We changed the narrative around the environment and the climate in Egypt from a sector that blocks or hinders investment, because that's how people think of the environment, because of the EIAs and there's so many requirements, to a sector that is a catalyst to the sustainable economic growth in different means and ways.
Thank you. The Minister has another appointment, so if you all could welcome, join me one more time in thanking her for her insights today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Adonai, when we look at what the MDBs are doing today in the realm of financing biodiversity, most of the efforts seem to focus on environmental safeguards and preventing net loss. But if we want to move to net gains, what are some of the low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, well, thanks again. And I'm very glad, actually, the minister that is doing now, she read my mind with her comment before. This is possibly the most exciting part of the interventions to bring back nature that we might have, turning nature into an investment, basically. That's actually the question. And there are three areas that I would identify as key for us as MDBs, right? One is data, the other one is investments, and the other one is markets, right? And at a growth level, let's say. On data, the challenge is to understand the state and the extent of the ecosystems around us, right? And how that evolves, right? And MDBs are in an ideal position right now to, through its projects, to share the data that we gather on biodiversity baseline data with, for example, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and help the global community fill in the puzzle of the status of biodiversity around us. So basically use our projects to gather that data and share it as a public good. We're currently updating our environmental social policy, and we will be trying to request to influence our clients to actually automatically set the baseline data in the format of GBIF, as I mentioned before, and automatically share it with them. So that's a contribution that we want to have. I think the World Bank is quite excited about it, and I think AIIB could easily do the same. Second, invest. And we were mentioning entry points, right? One of the entry points that we want to pilot, we are about to pilot, is that of biodiversity net gains. And I think the UK is at the forefront of this concept. So, Danny, when I imagine using our projects that by mandate need to be nature neutral, so no damage, no harm done to nature, using those projects as a vector to achieve biodiversity net gains wherever we can. Basically, projects that are in or around degraded land. Imagine all the linear infrastructure, roads, high voltage lines, mines, renewable projects that could actually be used to reforest to regain natural capital. So that could be a very good opportunity to actually, and again, UK DEFRA has spearheaded these efforts in the real estate sector, where any new investment needs to recover 10% of the footprint, either on site or buy credits from others. And the third angle that I mentioned, the creation of markets, which is linked to the second one, right? We need to create the incentive schemes that drive projects and investments with nature positive outcomes, either by creating sustainable business models, like, for example, a few years ago we financed a sustainable tourism project here in the Aqaba Bay next door in Jordan, that actually recovered degraded land. It's a high-end hotel, Ayla, actually. Recovered degraded land, restored the natural reef in front of it, and also created an artificial marina where they invested in a coral nursery. So their business model is around the preservation and the recovery of natural capital. So either that, or also create the revenue streams, or complementary, and create the revenue streams to actually incentivize nature positive outcomes, either through carbon removals and very, very much in tune with net zero claims by companies. So basically reforesting and selling those credits to companies that actually need to abate residual emissions, or helping develop biodiversity markets. So the overall idea, the ultimate idea, is to actually help turn investing in nature into a profitable business, right? In order to achieve systemic change. And that's what MDBs are here for, right? To change the market, to demonstrate projects and create markets for positive impacts.
Thank you, Adonai. Last year, the United Nations adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Some people call it the Paris Agreement for Nature. And it's shifting the conversation, shifting nature and biodiversity from the periphery to the core of investment opportunities. This can be particularly tricky, though, when it comes to infrastructure. As we've heard, the biodiversity risk can be quite high. So, Danny, at AIIB, how are you handling this?
Thank you. So you're right. This agreement is immensely important, and thinking through how we align ourselves to that agreement is quite a lot more complicated than aligning ourselves to the Paris Agreement, even though that in itself is a big challenge, because with nature, each specific case is very different, and that's why I mentioned we have teams of experts who work on every project to understand these issues and try and work out in each case what we should do, and we gave some examples. But we also know that from information from the Paulson Institute and the Nature Conservancy that there is a sort of nature financing gap, if you like, nature financing of about $700 billion per year, and so moving into this nature positive space that Az and I was talking about is absolutely critical. And so the work that we're doing to build up our biodiversity action plan, to prepare this report I was mentioning earlier on nature as infrastructure, is all designed to contribute to thinking about how do we achieve that in practice. I gave some examples of pilot projects that we're doing, which are actually nature-based solutions projects, where the purpose of the project is exactly as you were saying, to use the need that a particular place or community or country has for a particular kind of infrastructure, to discuss with the client, okay, you want to achieve this impact for water quality or wastewater treatment, or you're building your transport network. Have you thought about this different way of doing it? This way of doing it that delivers nature benefits, which rather than building concrete channels, as an example, use the ecosystem services, as the minister called it, of the infrastructure to deliver those goals instead. And the good news is that from the client side, there's a lot of interest in this. What we as MDBs have to build up is our expertise and our knowledge and our kind of menu of options that can be applied in any particular case, so that when we go and talk to the clients, we're not just saying, have you thought of this? We're saying, okay, here's 20 different ideas that we've seen in other parts of the world that have been effective that you could also apply. It's interesting, in China, this sponge cities concept is really one that's been developed in a lot of places, and that there are ideas from there that could be applied in urban infrastructure in other parts of the world. And I think MDBs also have a function of accumulating that knowledge and then spreading it and sharing it across our clients. And I think that's a key way in which we can go much further. And I have to say, China Exim Bank is also a leader in this space, especially in terms of understanding risk, the risks of biodiversity and nature for projects, and then applying that thinking to how they take the projects forward.
Danny, you mentioned the funding shortfall. The MDBs have pledged to mobilize $200 billion a year by 2030 to address biodiversity loss, and we're clearly not there yet. So Wencha, I'd like to ask you, what can financial institutions like the Export-Import Bank of China do to help close this gap?
Yeah, I think development financing issue is an issue that which has been there for so many years. I think we always face this inadequate development financing, not only for the poverty alleviation, also for the climate, fight against climate change. Now we are talking about, we don't have enough money for the biodiversity, So I think, that we face the limited resources, for addressing those daunting development challenges for many years. I think, certainly this is a very ambitious target for $200 billion a year by 2030. But certainly we should try everything we can to achieve that target. This is so important. Without resources here, you just cannot do it, right? I think this is we all know that, right? This is a reality. So I think you know, I feel that I think we have the estimation, right, by the UNDP, right? I think AIIB also mentioned that at the beginning about this gap, $700 billion a year, right, for addressing biodiversity issue. So I think we certainly see that more efforts need to be made by the developing economy, because I think you know, they made a commitment about you know, also a further increase of their support for GBF, a global biodiversity framework. And you know, like what they also commit for climate change, right? I think you know, some years ago. So I see this time also we do want to see the concrete action, you know, taken by the developing economy. Of course, emerging economy, developing countries, you know, including China, they will also make their due contributions in their capacity. So I think you know, this is something I do want to see, you know, that more efforts by the developing economy, you know, of course, together with emerging and developing countries. And also, secondly, I want to see more role played by the IMDb, by the IFI, UN agencies, because particularly for the IMDb. So they have resources, but also they have knowledge, they have the, you know, they can provide the capacity building, right? So I think together with the money for the project, they can, you know, also help developing country to improve their capacity and try to push for more knowledge transfer, more technology transfer to address the challenges related to biodiversity and nature protection. So I see that they can play a very important role. Of course, I want to mention that they cannot do this alone. They should work together with a national policy bank like us, and development bank, commercial banks, private sector, right, all together. So I think you know, you know, this is, and also I want to say that you know, see, we needed to really try to innovate financial instrument to try to mobilize more private sector money, including, you know, that providing like you know, this risk mitigation measure, de-risking. I think the minister mentioned at the beginning, and also try to also issue more bond, particularly bond, even for the biodiversity and the nature protection, like we did for the green bond these days. And of course, there's also many other measures to mobilize private sector involvement by also providing more guarantee operations, more risk transfer, you know, kind of operations. So I don't want time to go into detail, but I think we need to do more financial innovations to try to mobilize more private sector money, you know, by the IMDb, by the national policy banks, development banks. Lastly, I think we should help our developing member country to develop their capital market. I see that many countries don't have their capital market at all, so they rely on the bank support, right? This so-called indirect financing. They needed to have to build up their capacity for direct financing through the capital market, including bond market, you know, and equity, you know, that equity market. So I think that, you know, those are also very important for the many developing countries. With that, I will stop here. Yeah.
Thank you, Wenchai. You mentioned resources, and we're a section right here about opportunities. So, Minister Teo, I want to cut right to the chase here. If there was one project that you could ask the banks on this panel to fund in the area of biodiversity and infrastructure, what would that project be?
That's a very interesting question. I think the nature-based solution is just one area for funding. But in Tonga, we have a national biodiversity strategy and action plan that outlines various actions prioritized by government to 2030. So this document is a living document and aligned to various global frameworks and agreements. And so to integrate the targets set out with the in the global biodiversity framework, any of those projects in that framework, in that plan can be.
So is there any one project you'd like to ask these gentlemen to fund?
Not at the moment, but
all right, we'll take that discussion off stage. I'd like to open up the stage. We don't have a lot of time, but I see a hand right there for a question from the audience. Can we get the gentleman a mic, please?
I'm Eugene Simonov. I represent Rivers Without Boundaries International Coalition, NGO. I want to ask, I'm really happy to see here Vice President Zhang, because in 2016, I was witnessing amazing precedent when Exim Bank of China, after being informed by conservation experts and NGOs that a river of Egingol in Mongolia actually is a very important environmental asset and belongs to Lake Baikal Basin, which is a World Heritage Site, and in damming it could influence the huge important biodiversity asset, withdraw from that project and redirected the loan to Mongolia to much more environmentally sound project of wastewater treatment for the capital. And it was at the very late stage of decision making. It was a very wise and bold decision, which I believe the China Exim Bank should be always praised for. But my question is to now, some years later, to MDBs, whether such kind of given that at the end of the day, the degree to which you conserve nature, at least for next many years, will be counted on how much nature you save from destructive projects which you haven't financed. What is your freedom of influence on what you are investing, and how in this wonderful new framework of mainstreaming nature, the restraint, where are the new rules for restraint from projects which could be really destructive for nature, which, as you well know, despite your ALIAs, you are often investing.
Sir, if I can, I think the question is, how do we not fund projects that are going to destroy nature? Would one of the members of the panel like to answer that?
We have plenty of scope to say no to projects that are ecologically damaging. And the whole point of the environmental and social safeguards framework that we have is precisely to create a framework for understanding what are the impacts, how can they be mitigated, and if they can't be mitigated, have a basis for saying no to the projects. That's the whole basis of our project investment process, at least in respect of environmental and social issues. So we have plenty of opportunities to say no, and we do say no to projects for these reasons.
Yeah, I'll complement. That's precisely what we do. I'm sure you're aware, John, of the mitigation hierarchy that we apply when we finance our projects to first avoid, if not avoiding, to reduce, if not to restore, and if not to offset any impact on nature. And that is actually the basis of the concept of these biodiversity net gains, right? That concept of restoration in excess is what we're trying to do. So your question is on how to make sure that we don't bring in damage to nature. What we are trying to conceptualize, to think, is how to go beyond those safeguards and how to use our projects to recover nature as well. But as you say, the application of a strict mitigation hierarchy and the protection of nature is a conditio sine qua non, is a necessary condition for our projects. And if we don't do it right, civil society is there to raise the flag and tell us you're not doing it right, and we have our internal accountability mechanisms to actually correct any damage that we might have done.
Thank you, Adonai. As you say, everyone has a role to play. I have a question over here. Can we get a mic to Alex, please?
Thank you very much. Alex Hadjivanov, Environmental Sustainability Department, AIIB. My question actually refers to the points raised previously by our distinguished speakers, and also relates to the question from the audience before. We all know that MDBs are applying robust environmental and social safeguard policies, and they are largely successful. But there are a lot of activities at smaller scale, which are beyond the radar of the MDBs. And here I would refer to the points raised by Her Excellency Egyptian Minister about the policy upgrade of Egyptian policies and regulatory framework. What is the appetite among MDBs for policy dialogue? How we can help cross-pollinate and share good lessons learned from one country to another, maybe in a similar way like we do with capacity building, with technical assistance. I would appreciate to hear feedback from Danny and maybe from Adonai as well. Policy dialogue. Thank you.
Adonai, would you like to start?
Thank you, Alex. That's a very good question. Policy is possibly the most, but policy reform is possibly the most effective measure to achieve systemic change, to catalyze systemic change. Projects might be considered best practices, individual cases, but if we want to actually transform the countries where we operate and bring in best practice, we need to engage in policy reform. And this is precisely why the policy angle is one of the key pillars of this Blue Mediterranean partnership that we're trying to launch here in the southern Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, to basically invest in projects that present best practices in the different blue economy sectors and use them as an example to reform policies in those countries and make sure that those practices are replicated in mass, basically. So absolutely, we need to engage, even for the private sector, for private banks, we need to engage in bringing best practices in the regions where we operate. Danny, I don't know if you want to complement that.
I think I agree. Just maybe to add two things. So, I mean, I mentioned already the importance of the role of MDBs in knowledge sharing and knowledge exchange. We learn lessons in one place. We should be able to share that with other clients. I think we do that quite effectively in AIIB in some places, and there's other areas, other sectors where we have a lot of room for improvement. And so as we do more of the nature-based solutions projects, that will give us more of a kind of toolbox that we can then go to other clients and say, have you thought of this? This, you know, is it a project issue or a policy issue? AIIB doesn't currently have policy-based financing as one of our instruments. We are giving consideration to that in the context of climate finance, because we see that, exactly like Ed and I said, the interlinking between policy and the capacity of countries to deliver on their mitigation and adaptation commitments is so important. I guess that may have opportunities to bring nature in, but principally climate focused.
Yeah, if I may, I think based on my experience, I think we need to really help our developing member countries adopt, you know, the international standard. I know it's not easy. It will take time. I worked for the ADB for many years as a vice president for Central, Western Asia, and South Asia. I know that many countries they try to, you know, to nurture, improve their country system, but it will take some time. But I think we need to help them to gradually improve country system. So one day they could reach the international standard. Now they have a national standard, but later they move to a higher level, you know, international standard. So I think China Exim Bank, you know, now these days we are doing project in many other countries also. We try to help the host country, right, to adopt international standard, particularly like a ESG standard. So I think that's why we also try to do more capacity building, knowledge sharing with country concerned. That's why I said the money is not enough. You need to do more knowledge sharing, capacity building, you know, for these kind of things.
We have time for one last question. The gentleman here.
Thanks very much. Great session. Simon Zadek from Nature Finance. Actually, it builds on Alex's questions and your answers. You know, nature destruction happens because we have a global economy that's addicted to the overuse of unsustainable nature. It's not a coincidence or a mistake. It's the way most sectors are developed, notably the food sector, but also others. What all that leans to is not so much end of pipeline compliance, but economic and industrial strategy. Yeah, that unless we go upstream beyond the standards agenda in the first instance to really, where is an economy heading? How are central banks and ministries of finance and ministries of trade and industry really thinking about it? Ultimately, we can't fix the problem at the infrastructure level, even although the AIIB is an infrastructure financing institution. So the question is, perhaps particularly to you, Danny, but obviously all answers will be interesting, is how far upstream are you willing and able to go in helping your sovereign clients to begin shaping a next generation of economic strategies that develop markets and enterprises that are consistent with nature positive outcomes? And just as a sort of one-click aside, we've seen the ecological transition plan just released by the government of Brazil under Minister Haddad, the Minister of Finance. And I would say it's probably the best in the world when it comes to nature economy at this stage. So we have, if you like, a stalking horse out front, kind of pointing to a direction that we might emulate and build on. And I'm just curious as to whether AIIB and EBRD and also the Exim Bank can go upstream to that strategic level. Thank you.
Danny?
I know we're running out of time, so I'll be very brief. It's a really important question. So I think one area that we can do is kind of thought leadership. And so I mentioned earlier the kind of multifaceted piece of work on nature as infrastructure that our economics department is undertaking at the moment. Eric Bergloff was talking about it yesterday, and I think that is one area where we can go. AIB is a project finance institution, and so and we're one that's still growing and very much in development. So the capacity for that kind of policy dialogue in the countries is quite limited, to be honest. It's something that we may well come to later on, but we have to, I think, first really develop and hone our expertise in terms of how we can apply this thinking to the projects that we are doing. That's where we have to start. So I recognize the importance of what you say and of nature finance and the work that your organization is doing. I mean, it's getting the economics of this right that's really important. So if you treat something as free, then you're going to use and abuse it, and that's basically what's happened with nature over many years. And so how you value it and how you build those valuations into how financial decision making is made in governments, in finance ministries, and so on, is really important. When I was the Chief Secretary to the Treasury in the UK, we started a piece of work on natural capital, which was precisely designed to try and bring that into the national accounts, and therefore to influence how the UK thought about its economy. And that's now leading to some of the things that Ad and I was talking about, where DEFRA is now a leader in thinking about how do you apply this in different contexts. But you've got to start at that level. But AIB as an institution isn't the one that's going to lead that thinking for now, but recognize that it's important that somebody does.
All right, we are almost out of time. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the last question, which is if there's one thing you want the audience today and those online to take away, 30 seconds you have, what is it? Wenchai.
Yeah, I think it's not easy to address the issue related to nature and biodiversity, but I certainly believe that we should make more efforts at the regional, global, and country level to strengthen our cooperations, to give more resources, to do more capacity building, to try to push more knowledge, technology transfer to address these very challenging issues. I think at the end of the day, we want to see this really harmony between mankind and nature. This is good for all the people on the planet. So that's what I want to say.
Minister Teo.
Yep. Thank you again. I think as a steward of resources, I think we need to have a collective effort to change our actions to help preserve what resources we have and what we have at the moment, and be smart in building infrastructure that preserve nature.
Adonai.
I would say that shaping climate action was probably the biggest challenge of the generation of our mentors in sustainable finance and policy making. Possibly shaping nature action might be the most exciting challenge that we are facing right now. How to create markets that accelerate action for nature recovery and conservation. So I think I just want to share that positive, optimistic message. That it's a challenge and it's an exciting one.
Sir Danny.
When you think about infrastructure, think about nature. If we can change that conceptual idea that infrastructure isn't always man-made things, it's natural things as well, then it will change completely our thinking about what we can do, what we can finance, how we can deliver the kind of the solutions to the infrastructure challenges that our clients are bringing us. And then let's work in partnership. There are so many great people in this room and in this community. We all have to work together to solve these problems.
It's not easy to take complex issues like mainstreaming nature and biodiversity and distill it into 30 seconds, much less the insights that these gentlemen and Dr. Yasmin shared during this panel. please join me in extending a very round warm of thank you to our panelists. If we could have a photographer, please, gentlemen.